Firstly, when you look at GDPR, certainly from my perspective, there are a lot of common obligations. And those common obligations reflect the privacy by design element. There are provisions within the Singapore Act, Australian Act, all dealing with systems and requirements to have not just principles-based approach requiring you to comply, but having systems in place that deal with compliance and accountability. So various protective mechanisms exist. You've got to be able to demonstrate compliance. Most regimes have some form of access and correction, which then mirrors portability and some of the things we'll talk about. Increasingly, it's risk-based, and that's very important for how you think about compliance and the stakeholders. And they have some form of transparent information handling practices, including protection for overseas transfers. GDPR is wonderful in that it, as I said before, in its ambitious plan, clearly extends its territorial scope and says you're going to be bound by European laws, even though you might not be present in the jurisdiction, and provides some very clear legal requirements of how you would be caught by those provisions. So, for example, some of our businesses that potentially are caught by offering goods and services, you would need to comply. So interesting questions in terms of how you would do that in an organisation like ours. And the interoperability questions about overseas transfers are very heavily influenced by Europe. They have been up to now, and they will continue to be, and you've already had some good examples and discussions about the mechanisms that exist, the codes, the binding corporate rules. They're all European inventions, and we buy into those in order to create interoperability in the group, and I think that will continue to be the case. So GDPR and interoperability are intertwined, both in its design and its implementation stage, and certainly for us. You then look at some of the new rights and some of the new obligations, and embedded in those rights are also concepts of interoperability and the concept of trust and consumer protection. So how do you have portability when you don't have corresponding rights in those jurisdictions? You take a piece of data, orbit within qualified environments, take it somewhere else, and it loses its protection. That's nonsense. So for an organisation like ours, again, to implement a data portability regime, we have to think about it globally. So instantly you're thinking about, well, how would a consumer bank in Australia think about data portability, even though we have no corresponding rights of that kind? And that takes you well beyond privacy. That takes you to some of the developments about open banking, internet banking, and you start thinking about privacy in a very holistic way. In just a minute, when you do that, the concepts of trust, what is your consumer expecting, and interoperability start coming together in a very obvious and a very commercial way. They're not theoretical topics, they're topics that we spend a lot of commercial time dealing with. Last but not least, I picked out data breach notifications for obvious reasons. That is the point of transparency, both to the regulator and the individuals. But I also picked it out because the move to data breach notification in Australia, we will have mandatory data breach legislation coming into effect in February this year, so we will be a few months ahead of Europe, and that provides some interesting challenges in terms of combining our efforts. But the key issue here is not just the different threshold requirements of what is serious harm and how many hours you have to notify. It's the absolute focus that an organisation, a commercial organisation, needs to have to think about the harm that could be imposed on individuals. And all of a sudden, where do you land again? Trust and interoperability. Who are your customers? What could cause harm to them? What is serious for one set of customer or one individual customer could be entirely trivial or vice versa for another group of customers. So once again, you are having some pretty corporate discussions about some pretty personal issues.